This week we'll learn about callbacks and how we can use them to hook up the interactive elements that we added last week to our plot. Welcome to another MetPy Monday. Hello, I'm John Lehman, a software engineer for Unidata. This week we're going to hook up the interactive drop-down menus that we added to our application last week to our figure so we can select what we want for our X, Y, and color variables. Now, if you haven't seen the previous two videos in this series, I encourage you to go back and watch those so you can get to this point in our Dash app creation. Okay, so we're going to up here at the top when we're doing our imports, we're going to add two new things. The input with a capital I and output with a capital O objects. Now these are not input and output things that are on the user interface, but these are inputs and outputs to a callback or an interactive function that's going to run when one of these elements changes. So when an input changes, the callback will get called and it will affect those changes on whatever's an output. All right, so now we're going to go down here into our app and do a little bit of preparation. Right now our drop-downs don't have an ID that we've assigned, and we need to assign an ID so that we can refer to them as inputs by that ID. Same thing as an ID in your HTML. So we're going to set the ID to be xvar drop-down. We'll go down here to our Y variable, set the ID to be yvar dropdown, and to our color dropdown, ID is cvar dropdown. The other thing, which may not seem super intuitive, is we're going to, in this graph object, we're going to delete assigning the figure to be the fig object that we create. Because that object is not going to get created immediately, it's going to be created by our callback function, and it wouldn't exist at that point. So we're going to take this figure creation right here and put it inside a function, hence why it won't exist yet. And that function we're going to call update figure. Update figure is going to take xvar, yvar, and cvar. Now to make this function a callback, we're going to use the app.callback decorator. And if you remember decorators, they're a function that takes a function and contains a function and returns a function. Now if that's a little confusing, that's okay. We've got lots of videos on how to write your own decorators, but you don't need to understand that to just use this decorator. So up here at the top of our function, we're going to apply the decorator, which is the @ symbol, app.callback. And inside this, we're going to pass inputs and outputs. So the first thing is an output. The output, first we put the ID of what we want to affect. Down here the ID is buoy correlations. And then we put what attribute of that we want to affect. We want to set the figure attribute. So whatever this function returns is going to be set as the figure attribute of the thing with the ID buoy correlations. So that tells us that we need to return a figure from this function. Next are the inputs. The input first is going to be xvar dropdown. That's the ID. And what property do we want to get from the dropdown as the input to the function? Well, we want the value. So we're going to get the value attribute. We'll continue adding inputs, our yvar dropdown. We're going to get the value of it. And our cvar dropdown. And we're going to get the value from it. So now our decorator, we're passing it the input and outputs all in one here. So an output, 3 inputs. And this decorator is going to be run whenever any of those inputs changes. You can think of this kind of like a spreadsheet, where the inputs are the cells that this is watching, and anytime you change one of those cells in a spreadsheet, everything that depends on it gets recalculated, right? And that's how this callback is going to operate. Anytime that anything the callback depends upon changes, the callback is going to be run. So we've created our figure in the callback, and we need to return our figure. So we're going to return fig because that is what's going to be set as the figure attribute of the thing with the ID buoy correlations. Now, just to make our app a little fancier, because we can, we're going to use the update layout method. And we're going to set the transition duration keyword argument to be 1000 milliseconds or a second. This will nicely animate our map so it doesn't just snap changes as we change what the variables that we're plotting are. It makes a smoother transition, it's a little more visually appealing, and it's honestly what people are getting used to based on all of their experience with other web apps. They're used to these really nice user interfaces, and it takes very little effort using Dash to implement something like this. So now that Fig's created here, that's why we couldn't create it here. When the app loads, it's going to use the default values and call the callback once because these are getting changed from a null. So we don't have to do any explicit calls of the update figure method. So now we open up a terminal and we're going to go ahead and run our app. Now it's on the debug server. We've got our URL here and we'll open it up in a browser. So here's our app in the browser. It looks the same as last week, but now these boxes can actually do something. So if I want to plot let's pick a variable where we know we've got a lot of data. Maybe the latitude versus air temperature, that could be interesting. I could plot, let's just make sure it works like we think. I could plot latitude against latitude. Well, that doesn't look quite right, does it? So if we look, no matter what I'm changing my plot to, the plot actually makes the same plot every time. It's just animating because we told it had to animate during the callback. So for example, if you pick some dots and watch them, I can change to a totally different variable and they're still in the same spot. So this app has the illusion of working, but doesn't. And that's why I did something that I knew what the result should be, like plot latitude against latitude. And we should have had a one-to-one line. Also, none of my labels are changing. So let's go back to our app. And do you see what we missed? Yeah, so we need to change the actual things that are getting plotted to use what's getting passed to the callback. So xvar, and instead of air temperature, yvar, and instead of the color being pressure, it's going to be cvar. Okay, now our app reloads for us. And let's try this again. I'm going to plot water temperature against water temperature. There, now we're getting the expected behavior. Again, why it's so important to verify behaviors. We have that one-to-one line. So we could do something like plot latitude against water temperature. So when we get to the high latitudes, we generally see lower water temperatures. That's somewhat what we would expect. We can plot things such as the wind speed against the wave height and leave it colored by pressure. We could plot we don't have that many dominant wave direction data. We could plot wind speed against the water level above mean. There's even fewer data there, unfortunately. Or dew point, and color it by wind gust. We could do all kinds of these different plots to see what correlations we can find. So for example, is there any correlation of, let's put latitude and wind direction. Okay, maybe we don't expect that. What about latitude and air temperature? Yep, that seems to be what we'd expect. And we know that water temperature is already related. So we could go find water temperature and recolor by water temperature. So we do see these colder water temperatures associated with colder air temperatures associated with the higher latitudes. So that makes exactly, it's what we would expect. So as you can see, with not that much code, we're able to build an interactive app. So with 54 lines of code, able to build a web app that lets us do this interactive data exploration. And we can pick some data to zoom in on. We can do a lasso selection. And these are all things that we can use to tie together multiple plots. I hope that you found this useful, and I'll see you on next week's MetPy Monday.